My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, Guru Piran Neo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm going to continue with Mahan's teachings on the different school of thought. I want to spend a little bit more time on Advaita teaching because this is very important. In the last class, we spoke about both the Advaita and the Advaita and what are the common features and what are the any differences with the two schools of thought. I want to go a little bit more deeper because you see that a lot of Mahan's teachings are aligned to the Advaitic teachings, and it's good to have a good understanding of what the fundamentals of Advaita, so that as we progress in Mahan's I Got philosophy, you'll be able to understand the various underpinnings of this philosophy. So let me recap on what we saw in terms of Advaita. Mahan in the book talks about monoism. Here, monoism is one realizes one's own true self through experiences of the intellect, and there is no external worship. It is purely an internal journey, and this is what the pure mono is. And we also saw the case of Advaita. Advaita is essentially there's a difference between God, nature, and the self. And through the practice of bhakti, one acquires jnana, and through that evolution enables one to converge, experience that convergence between God, nature, and oneself. And eventually the convergence, intensifies, and we see that, the self, nature, and God becomes, at a converged state. So we summarize this, the Advaita, as I mentioned, through bhakti and jnana. And jnana here is grace of God. The more grace you get, the more enlightened you become, the more bhakti intensifies. This cycle repeats, and one attains this porousness. The self, nature, and God becomes more and more porous. Ultimately, you see that, they are all part and parcel of this God. Advaita also speaks about the oneness, and he also speaks about why we see the separateness, and one can attain that oneness through introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. So we have these concepts, and I want to then explain to you a few other important models that you want to keep in mind, so that you see the convergence between the Advaita philosophy and the Advaita philosophy. And we see that at the end of the culmination or the finality of both, you see that both becomes one with that, infinite, formless, dimensionless, universal, call it consciousness or reality. Mahan calls it the big I. So I want to introduce to this concept of the spiritual compass, and that some of you all would have heard about it, but I want to bring it in this context of Mahan's teachings. So again, I think all of us know what the compass is. The compass is actually to guide us to this universal truth of the Paramahamsa. And like the compass, in every compass gives us directions. And the compass has some very interesting qualities. And the compass gives you direction to the North Pole, the South Pole, and also the, and the North Pole and South Pole. You see that if you are away from the North Pole, the compass will show you the direction. And as you progress, it guides you to where the North Pole is, or for that matter, even South Pole is. And when you get to the North Pole, you see that the compass becomes random. And we see that, what that means is that as long as you are away from that universal truth, the Paramahamsa, you'll always be longing and searching for it. The moment you attain that, the moment you are in the North Pole, every direction, the compass will show in all directions. It becomes random. So as long as you're away from that God realized state or that Paramahamsa, the attainment of the Paramatma or the big I, the compass will show you the direction. The day you attain it, the compass becomes everywhere. And you see that you'd be able to cognize God in its universal form in every direction. And this is what this Paramahamsa quality is. And as I mentioned, the Paramahamsa has got some important qualities, like the swan. It has a mind that is universal, but still engaged in this material world, not be touched by it or not be absorbed by it like the swan. We also see that the compass guides us to the Paramahamsa quality, where it dips its beak, its intelligence into that materiality and take what's nutritious to sustain itself, but it's not impacted by all the contaminants. So how do we get to this abode of this Paramahamsa or the big I? This is what Advaita and Advaita speaks about. I want to show you the convergence between the two. Now, this continuum has this pursuit of this religious pursuit of bhakti on the South Pole, and the North Pole is somewhat like the spiritual pursuit of the discovery of the self. And both that, to attain that God-realized state through bhakti and the self-realized state, one needs two important things. One is the search for truth. Truth means, using scientific methods and unbiased, view and perspective of life. A lot of our biases come from our senses. Our senses, it continuously changes according to time and place and circumstances. So the truth here is that no matter what the time, place, and circumstances, it remains the same. And this is what one great saints and sages that pursued that intensive bhakti or that self-realization process, they had a lens of scientific pursuit, that is to observe, to experience that reality. This is why Swamiji say, Arivin Arival. Arivin, the Arivu is intellect. The experiential learning is very important, not just theoretical book knowledge. So this is one aspect, putting your mind under intensive scrutiny, putting your intellect under intensive scrutiny, putting your senses under intensive scrutiny so that you know what the truth is. So this is what we call scientific, you gather evidence of all the experiences that you go through. On the left-hand side, the search for truth is through a rational pursuit, the use of reason and logic to be able to understand why a particular phenomena, why you're experiencing this. So both the rational pursuit and the scientific pursuit is what great saints and sages like Mahans and others put to good use. The rational pursuit and the scientific pursuit is what we call vichara. And this is the part that we've been emphasizing along a lot, that is introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. So I'm going to show you that convergence. And right in the center of this compass is the I, the subject that is experiencing, that is observing, that is, and later on you'll see that that is essentially creating all this experience. So this Paramahamsa mind, one needs to acquire the Paramahamsa mind, that calm, cool, serene, beautifully gliding, requires a spiritual compass to give us direction, to enable the mind to be able to transform from that fleeting, transitory, limited mind to a mind that is more permanent, eternal, and universal. And this is what the Paramahamsa. So you can differentiate between a duck and a swan. A duck tends to make a lot of noise, and dabbles in a lot of, material dirt. whereas the swan is more calm and cool and gliding. So how do we transition from that gross mind to a more refined and universal mind? And that spiritual compass actually guides us. And later on, we'll speak about what that spiritual compass is about. So we see that the Advaita teachings, the Advaita school of thought, essentially um, is what the self-realization process, and Advaita is actually the dualism, which is pursued the bhakti. So we see, let's take the Advaita school of thought. We see that the Advaita school of thought, the I is the subject that pursues this bhakti knowledge to acquire the grace of God. So the mind that searches for that God realized state through the pursuit of acharas, and the direction of the arrow is in this direction, means there is an external search from that subject. And through this acquisition, through this bhakti and discipline, one gets, a little bit more focus on, the pursuit of the divinity. The mind becomes more calmer, more cooler. And you see that ultimately that process of bhakti leading to jnana leads one back ultimately to that I, which is the Nan. And this is where that whole bending word backwards to acquisition of the grace of God, the mind becomes, more enlightened, and you see that the material world slowly dissipates, and there's a convergence that takes place, and ultimately one attains that non-kadavul state, the kadavul, that embarking within oneself and realize that I am a manifestation of that God. So this grace of God and the convergence is part of the Advaita school from the spiritual compass model. In that same way, we see that in the Advaita is that we know that we are a subject. Sometimes we are caught in this multiplicity of, the differences between self, nature, and also God. So we pursue this self-realization process through introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. So there is something that you do. Even meditation is doing something, you see, and introspection is doing something. So this Advaitic knowledge teaches us now to do something to slowly silence that material, world around us through yoga and all those things. So this is an active pursuit, and slowly that active pursuit, enables the mind to divinize all this material experiences and thoughts and folds it into that, inner consciousness. And we see that pursuit of silence through introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation leads to the first door opening, which is silence. In that silence, the mind becomes more calmer, more cooler, and the neural connectivity is relieved from all this material, experiences and appearances and everything. The mind becomes the more calmer, the neural network's bandwidth becomes deeper and wider, a sense of expansion that takes place. So you see that our bandwidth expands and a sense of understanding becomes better. So this expansion is the expansion of jnana. When the jnana comes in, we attain liberation. We're not impacted by this material world. And ultimately, one converges to that finality state that I am that. So we see that this continuum takes place. Ultimately, the Trinity becomes that oneness. So we see that both that God realization in its fullest form leads to that, I am a manifestation of God, and that full intensive self-realization process, the deep tapas, leads one to that self-realization, I am that. And one is a manifestation, the other one is I am that. There is, subtle, very subtle, except for the semantics, they mean the same thing in the ultimate. For both users, this truth, it both, use both the scientific approaches and also the logical approach, not a dogmatic approach. Dogmatic approach means it's a belief. You can believe something, but it may not be true. But here you are pursuing the truth through experience. So the Swamiji says, Arivin, Arival, Arivin, Telivu. Telivu means clarity. Telividam, Telivai, Tendadu Jnanam. So through that clarity, one acquires jnana. Jnaname unarvu. So that means the jnana is actually our vibration. Our Bhagavan's Geetam. Unarve ungalin arivu. That means your own intellect, your own self, your own cosmic intelligence. So here, both this knowledge is very important. So it's no more, the whole idea of, external search. It's all about the internal pilgrimage. So ultimately, we start with the I, that is engaging through bhakti or through meditation or tapas. Ultimately, it leads back to itself. This, universal, formless, dimensionless, big I that Swamiji talks about. So whether you pursue intensively the bhakti, when I mean the pure form of bhakti of, discipline and also the acquisition of jnana, one comes back to the same position, and the same thing with respect to the self-realization. So this is why we see that whenever people ask Swamiji, how do I attain this? He says, Unarvu gauni pa, muerchi pa. He says, put in the effort and anchor your mind onto that vibration. So this is what Swamiji's, the Advaitic formula, Advaitic model leads to that ultimate Dvaita and Advaita. The boundaries become more porous, and ultimately they lead to the same pursuit. And this is what Swamiji actually says. It depends on what the platform you're standing from. The spiritual compass, all of us have the spiritual compass. The spiritual compass is actually our human mind. And the human mind, like how the normal compass is attracted, it's got various materials that are, pulled by North Pole and South Pole. The same thing, our mind is also made out of various composition. Whereas in the compass, it's made out of metals that have electromagnetic. Our mind is made out of our thoughts. And our thoughts is what essentially gives us direction and gives us action and all. So if our thoughts are very material, if our thoughts are very limited, you see that our direction also, our experience also is limited. But if our thoughts are lofty, if our thoughts are, grand, if our thoughts are, universal, we see that our journey also becomes more and more universal. Ultimately, we become that. So in this, Swamiji clearly states that, the reality depends very much on the composition or the characteristics or the DNA of the mind. And he says that, for a devotee, a devotee's mind is that there is this external God that is giving me grace, and be it be of any God, the multitude of gods. And you say that for that person, everything that they see is of that God, and that's what the mind of a devotee is. The mind, anchors itself on this formed God, that it sees everything as that formed God. So if the compass is residing in a particular place or shows a particular direction, that's the direction that one will get to. So, but you see that for a scientist, everything is atoms and molecules. So he sees everything in the form of atoms and molecules, because that's what the mind is attuned to. That's what the compass is showing. That's what the compass direction is. Similarly, a philosopher will say everything is in the state of mind, nothing else. The world you see, the world you cognize, everything's the state of mind. If the mind changes, the world also changes, right? So he says, for the philosopher, all things seen are but existing in the mind. That's what the DNA of that mind is. And the last one Swamiji says is that the one who has realized this, through intensive bhakti or intensive Advaitic search, the self-realization state. They say that, still seeking, the seeker finds himself that God. So you see that this notion of that self ultimately leads you back to that subject that is searching, whether it's through Dvaita or whether it's through Advaita. So Dvaita also has that, and Advaita also has that. So both leads to that ultimate state of God realization. So we see that Swamiji, the Advaitic philosophy and the Dvaitic philosophy in its ultimate leads to that convergence or that oneness. So, and Swamiji, clearly highlights this important concept in the I God book. So we see that, ultimately, the compass should guide us to that universal reality. So though our material body, as Swamiji says, restless is blood circulation, eternal is nature. Nature is continuously expanding, and we see that nothing is permanent in this material world because the laws of physics of this material world embedded with time is continuously changing, continuously expanding. But all this expansion and the change is happening within one reality, which is essentially that I, which is the origin of all. And Swamiji says that DNA is embedded in us. That universal identity is embedded in us. And that's what gives us cognition. That's what gives us experience. That's what gives us everything. So he says, if you discover that, then you discover everything. So essentially, we see that the spiritual compass is the essence of this I God philosophy, which is actually the Advaitic form of that oneness. Where the compass actually, when it's in the North Pole, it shows in all directions in a random way. So this is another insights into the Advaitic and the Dvaitic philosophy. Though Mahan has given just one paragraph, we see that through research and intensity, we see that we have better understanding of both the Dvaita and the Advaita teaching. There are many, many models that are used to describe this. We have spoken about, the model, which is the compass model. We spoke about the prism model. I think the last time I presented. The next time I'll speak about the wave model. How the wave and the ocean, and how they are separate but not separate. Okay, and then we'll talk about other models of the chariot and a number of other models to give you a very good insights on how nature describes all of this from a dualistic and also from a universal perspective. So we see that both the dualism and the oneness is two sides to the same coin. So again, and it's embedded by a core, which we call the, big I or Paramatma. So when the mind converges to that level, it sees both, the Dvaita and Advaita is the mode to, realize that universal reality or the oneness. So what is all this? Why is all this important in our lives? It tells us that both, the Dvaita approach or the Advaita approach is that both the material world and the spiritual realm are two sides to the same coin, right? And if one is able to converge the two through the spiritual pursuit, through the spiritual compass, you see that our life will become so rich. At the core of our spiritual being, everything plays, everything dances. The spiritual realm is the screen and everything else plays out. Similarly, we see that the spiritual capital is the most fundamental capital that we need to nurture, we need to develop, and we need to sustain through this pursuit of, self-realization or God realization. And if we are able to do that, you see that our physical capital, our physical health will improve, our mental capital will improve, our intellectual capital will improve. If we have very healthy body, healthy mind, and very sharp intellect, our creative capital will increase. If we are able to acquire the creative capital, very, very easy to understand things, complex ideas, you get new insights, and you see that you're able to unlock the natural capital in you. I always say this, nature has not given everybody everything in this limited body, but nature has embedded something special for each one of us, and if we harness the spiritual capital, our physical health, our intellectual capital, our mental health, and our creative capital, you will be able to cognize what your own natural capital is. And if you're able to do that, we're able to build strong understanding, relationships, cooperations, collaborations, and this is where the social capital improves. And when we are able to relate to everything, we see something, an important, capital, intangible capital that is in all of us called the empowered capital. You feel a sense of, being able to do anything and everything under even the most difficult circumstances. You feel empowered, you feel self-sufficient, you feel that you can do it, you see, and and because the whole idea is that if I have the universal personality and God with me, do I need anything else? I'll be able to overcome everything and anything. And this is what that empowerment is. And with that self-empowerment, we see that we acquire the leadership, capital. And the leadership capital leads to, the economic capital, ability to have that financial means to support this material world. So we see that while Advaita talks about this material external approach, that intensity leads to the oneness. And in that oneness, our life becomes more richer, more expanded, more enlightened, and also, more importantly, we learn to live to outlive everything. And this is the beautiful part of this. Different schools of thought gives you seemingly different perspective, but at the core, they are actually bounded by the same universal reality. And if we understood that, we would understand our own self. Though we have a lot of, diverse engagement, diverse thoughts, diverse experience, they're all anchored onto that self, or that big I, or that, Atma, the Paramatmic, substratum in all of us that keeps everything intact. And when the mind, through bhakti or through deep introspection, we see that the mind realizes it is that. When the mind realizes it is that, everything else is trivial. Everything else is beautiful, enriching, and inspiring. And this is what both the Advaita teaches us, of that convergence to God, giving you that ultimate spiritual reality. And the tapas through Advaitic philosophy says you are that reality. So, and this is what is teachings of both schools of thought are. Sandosham.